something inhuman has come to Tarker's mills. As unseen as the full moon riding the night sky high above, it is the werewolf, and there is no more reason for its coming now than there would be for the arrival of cancer, or a psychotic with murder on his mind. Its time is now, its place is here. In this little Maine town where baked bean church suppers are a weekly event, where small girls and boys still bring apples to their teachers, where the nature outings of the Senior Citizens Club are religiously reported in the weekly papers. Next week there will be news of a darker variety. The cycle of the werewolf has begun. 1985's Silver Bullet, as well as the 1983 novel that it is based on, reinterprets the werewolf narrative and delivers a different spin that critiques both the constraints of the traditional monster movie as well as slasher films that were in their peak at this time. In its history, the werewolf story typically featured the one who was bitten and becomes the werewolf as either the main character or at least a strong supporting character. And in those tales it was never unclear who the werewolf was and what was happening. We know from the outset of 1941's The Wolfman that Larry Talbot is in fact the Wolfman. In Werewolves of London, we are aware that Wilfred Glendon is infected after he gets bitten in one of the first scenes. The entirety of An American Werewolf in London is built off of David Kessler getting attacked as well. That is the conventional narrative, where we find an innocent man who is attacked by a wolf in the first scene, who later becomes a monster against their will. There is no mystery about it, and it's a particular kind of horror that is created that builds a fear of oneself. The horror is derived from the self-reflection that we ourselves are the monster, and that there is nothing we can possibly do to stop ourselves. Only death will cure us. But that isn't the case in these two takes on the traditional lore. Here, Stephen King develops in that style that he pioneered, that features a small town with weird stuff, his version of the werewolf, which are in both titles very rooted in history as well as redesigned and recontextualized for modern audiences. Salem's Lot asks what would happen if a vampire moved into a small town in Maine. It asks what if a cosmic evil clown demon moved into a small town in Maine. And similarly, Cycle of the Werewolf asks what would happen if a werewolf moved into a small town in Maine. And what all of these things have in common aren't the monsters, it's that the works are about the towns and the people within them primarily, and how they react to the monsters, not the monsters themselves. That is always secondary to the emotions and relationships at the forefront. In roughly 1980 or 1981, a now-defunct calendar company, Zavista, wanted to publish a werewolf horror-themed calendar that was to be illustrated by Bernie Wrightson, and they commissioned Stephen King to write miniature blurbs that would accompany each image of every month. King agreed and began the process, and Wrightson began the art in 1981 and would continue to work on it until 1983, at the same time that he was illustrating Creepshow. But somewhere in the middle, King became frustrated by the constraints that the limited space on the calendar placed on him, and Zavista was pushed out of the picture and the calendar became a short book instead that would have 12 chapters, one for each month, that would detail a year in the life of a town after the arrival of a werewolf, and each chapter would feature 3 original illustrations by Wrightson. This also properly started King's relationship with Wrightson, who, as I said, would go on to do both cover art and interior art on King's Creepshow in '82, as well as providing all of the illustrations for the 1990 release of the complete and uncut The Stand, and 2006's The Wolves of Kala. I think personally that this was one of the best artist and writer partnerships of all time, and I really wish that they had had the chance to work together more. And even though Jay Lee is the artist that typically comes to mind with modern visual representations of King's work, after his art was heavily featured in Marvel's Dark Tower comics, as well as him designing the first edition cover of The Wind Through the Keyhole. But for me, whenever I'm reading a King novel, Wrightson's art always comes to mind as influence to my imagination of how the world should look. And in short, Bernie Wrightson defined the look of Stephen King's universe in a physical sense to me at a very, very young age. Starting professionally in the late 60s, Wrightson really was one of the most talented comic artists of all time and was criminally underrated in my opinion, still being a fairly obscure character to this day that most people who aren't involved with comics don't know about. The things that he could do with pen and ink were astonishing, and the way that he was able to use deep saturated black tones in his ink really gave a strong feeling of dread in normal everyday settings, which really lends well to Cycle of the Werewolf, where we find a town slowly being destroyed and dismantled in body and spirit once every month with the rising of the silver moon. Because of the nature of starting out as a calendar, The novel takes place over the course of 1 year, and really until the end of it is a series of short stories that are mainly separate, taking focus on victim after victim in Tarker's mills on the night of the moon. The novel is really great, and because of the way that it was incepted, it makes for a unique addition to his eclectic body of work. The novel isn't concerned with the monster, and at the end of the day, the point of the whole thing is that it doesn't matter who the wolf is at all, or if it's even a wolf that is killing people. What matters is that innocent people are getting killed and something has to stop it. What is more interesting in King's opinion is the reactions of those who live in the town to the killings and the paranoia that they express to each other. He likes to explore the denial of the situation, and the agony of those who have lost people, and the fear that the person sleeping beside you could actually be a homicidal maniac. Midway through the novel in the month of August, after a great number of people have already been slaughtered by the beast, the town's constable, Neary, says to a crowd, "Sure, I think it's a werewolf. I think he's like that. I don't think he knows what he's doing when the moon gets full and he goes out and kills somebody. He could be anybody. A teller at the bank, a gas jockey at one of those stations out on Town Road. Maybe even someone right here, now. In the sense of being an animal inside and looking perfectly normal outside. Yeah, you bet. But if you mean, do I think that there's a guy who sprouts hair and howls at the moon? No. I think this line is one of the most important in the novel because it directly comments on the reality that was the late 70s and early 80s, where you had very normal-looking men being arrested for doing bestial things to dozens of innocent people. Men were butchering other men and women and children like they were livestock. And through that lens, King reinvents the werewolf story for the modern age where serial killers are now in the mainstream popular thought, by making the fear about other people and their capabilities, rather than the self's capability to become a monster that is out of control of the self. This has always been his strongest attribute as a writer in my opinion, because he is much scarier to me whenever he uses situations based in reality like Misery, rather than that of the supernatural. But even when he does rely on the supernatural, the greater danger more frequently lies in your neighbor or your loved ones, rather than the demon at your door. 2 years after its release, Dino De Laurentiis, working with Paramount Pictures, decided to film an adaptation of the novel titled Silver Bullet, hiring writer and director of Phantasm, Don Coscarelli, to direct the picture, and Stephen King himself to write the film and adapt his own novel. I think this was a really smart move creatively and allowed King to revisit the novel to reinvent and refine the concept that he had used in Cycle of the Werewolf, with some time in between the projects to look at it again with fresh eyes. The main difference on the surface of the story of this film and the story of the novel is that it has to change to fit a more traditional narrative construction. Whereas each month of the novel is a story unto itself featuring a new character that adds to the larger narrative of the town, here we have to take a less bird's-eye view of the community, as per the rules of traditional narrative filmmaking where we have to focus on a main character and build out from there. This isn't a bad thing, and in fact we still do get snippets of short stories within the movie, as there are a lot of characters who appear for only one scene or only one shot that are still vital to the feel of the movie. I find this to be the best representation on film of what the first half of a King novel feels like. He always waits a long time before introducing the evil into the story, and lets us just sit with the town and get to know the people within it. The vampires in Salem's Lot aren't properly introduced until the last chapter of Act 1. Cujo does not attack his first human victim until about halfway through the book. And I think this is a vital aspect that a lot of horror novelists miss out on, because without the context of who is in danger, the audience won't care about any of the type of horrors that you pull out of your hat. I collect paperback horror novels, and very frequently you can open one to find a supernatural event happening within the first chapter, and I think this is a huge mistake. They always like to skip the first act, but you really harm your story by not introducing the characters properly before you open the floodgates. And this movie does that really well. There is a tone-setting killing at the very beginning as well as another around 10 minutes in, but there isn't any danger that directly threatens a proper character that we know until roughly 23 minutes into the movie. And for the most part, we spend the entire first act at the town fair, at the local bar. We see kids riding bikes, hanging out by the lake, and flying kites. And the action with the wolf doesn't really ramp up until about the 45-minute mark. And this works really well and lets us know our cast of characters and bond with them before the wolf comes into their lives. The cast here are all really doing their best to give it a great small-town vibe, and work really well off of each other. Gary Busey is the standout and gives the performance of his career. He was really involved with his character, playing Red, Marty's drunken uncle, and got permission from Stephen King himself to ad-lib all of his lines to try and stay true to the character. He also did all of his own stunts for the movie, and you can even see one instance where he jumps through a mirror and actually cuts himself as blood runs down his arm. If you've ever discredited him as an artist because of his wacky antics in real life, I would encourage you to watch this movie to see that he really can act when given good material to work with. Terry O'Quinn, Megan Follows, and Corey Haim all do solid work as well to bring the story to life. But the other giant here really is Everett McGill. He has always been one of my favorite actors, and with this along with Twin Peaks and The People Under the Stairs, he makes a great imprint on horror, and I wish he had done more things before he retired, as the quantity of his filmography is sadly not substantial. The movie is weirdly funny in dark ways as well, with the fashion that it transitions between scenes, with my personal favorite being a group of town rednecks being torn apart in a bloodbath in the woods while hunting the wolf, that cuts immediately to a line of caskets in the Baptist church while everybody is rocking back and forth singing Amazing Grace. It is a style that is really reminiscent of the gallows humor that peppers King's writing and only adds to the film. Really, the only thing I don't like about the movie is they really 80s it up, which is something I normally don't have a problem with at all. It detracts a little here because the book was so grim and hopeless and solemn. In the book, Marty is just a boy in a wheelchair that appears in 2 out of the 12 stories, and is mentioned in a couple of others. But in the movie, instead of a normal wheelchair, they give him this rocket chair called the Silver Bullet that is really a motorcycle turned into a wheelchair that he rides around town at like 90 miles per hour. In the book, Marty's uncle just asks his friend to make silver bullets for him, while in the movie, Marty's uncle goes to a man that the narrator describes in a mystical way and presents him as almost like a magic bullet maker, a descendant from the forge masters of old.
He was, Uncle Red said, an old-world craftsman, a sort of wizard of weapons.
It makes the movie a little more silly than King's book, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's just a thing. Some may like the more lighthearted tone here, and at the end of the day it's not a deal breaker, as even though there are similarities between the two works, they really are very different beasts. And in a fitting way, one of the biggest downfalls of this movie is the wolf itself. De Laurentiis originally hired a professional dancer to play the wolf because his vision for it was to be a lot more fast and agile like an actual wolf. King vetoed that decision in favor of wanting a more scary wolf that lurked in the shadows and was hardly seen. And the two argued back and forth of what the wolf should actually be like, which delayed the actual creation of the wolf makeup and suit, until it was decided what the makeup would have to do on screen. During this time, Coscarelli shot a lot of the non-werewolf scenes, but eventually got frustrated by the process and left the film before it was completed, and was replaced by Dan Attias. It's kind of funny actually that Coscarelli has such an eye for visuals that you can plainly see which parts of the movie came from him, and which parts didn't. As a lot of the film, like the sequence where Jane is going around town collecting cans and bottles, is saturated with his dreamy style. Phantasm is one of my favorite films of all time, and I think there are parts of this movie that echo that one really strongly, and it makes me appreciate it all the more. And it also makes me sad that he left before he could see the project completed, because I imagine the finished film would have been even better if he had. But to me, none of this negates what the actual film says about werewolves, and how it turns them into an allegory for serial killers, and the paranoia of a town that knows one lies within its borders. Because as someone who comes from small-town America, I love the way this film accurately shows the strange realities of living in a small rural community. How people begin to gossip, and how at times that can lead to groups who decide to take the law into their own hands, leaving more innocent bodies in their wake. And in a way, the paranoia here is in a direct response to America's ugly history of mob violence against black people. That isn't even me reaching. Terry O'Quinn literally says that in the movie.
And private justice is about a step and a half away from lynch mobs and hang ropes.
But this little film, with marching bands in the fall, where girls play at the fair and kids travel on bikes, is able to say something important and new within the context of the werewolf movie. Because, for the most part, it takes the werewolf out of the equation. We haven't even talked about who the wolf is in the film, and to be honest, it doesn't matter. Cycle of the Werewolf and Silver Bullet work together in conjunction to build this idea of repudiating what slasher films were about, by making people important. They go out of their way to show that these people are not disposable, and that they are living, breathing entities that make up a valued part of a community. We get to know them well before they're gone, and without them there seems to be a hole that is missing that will never be filled. And that, to me, is where the true horror lies. Because there are monsters out there. They may not be literal werewolves, but they are out there. And it is all too easy for a person to think that nothing could happen to them before they disappear. Before the beast gets them. Because while the movie is about a werewolf, it is really about your neighbor, your priest, your teacher, your lover, your friends. People you think you know, but may not actually. because it's saying that it could happen anywhere, and that any place could be like that cold northern town of Tarker's Mills, where outside the tracks of wolves begin to fill with snow, and the shriek of the wind seems savage with pleasure. There is nothing of God or light in that heartless sound. It is all black winter and dark ice.